Hello, welcome to the first ever Rainbow Space Magic Con. This is the last author reading panel. I am Chloe. I am the author of Duality, and I'll be giving a reading of Duality. I'll be reading a part of chapter 1 today. So I've written other things. I've written Stations of Life as well as 3 a.m. I usually focus on like sci-fi as well as like contemporary sort of like realistic narratives. So I'm very excited to get started. And then let's see here, KL.
Hi, I'm KL Noone, and I write a lot of queer, paranormal, fantasy, usually very inspired by some of my academic research in fantasy and folklore, and I'm published with JMS Books, and excited to be on the last author panel for the day and getting to close this out with you, Chloe.
Yeah, this is very exciting. So I guess we'll go ahead and we'll get started. I believe that I'm going to be starting with Duality, and I'm actually going to be starting from a different part of chapter 1 because I wanted to be sure that we had enough time to introduce some of the major characters in the story. So without further ado, we'll get started with Duality. Melody carefully typed out the necessary forms to send to her supervisor. As soon as she finished one, her IntelliFile system brought up another. She bounced her legs as she sat, struggling to focus. Her workplace, methodical and metallic, was always freezing. Today, she wrapped her leather jacket around her shoulders in an attempt to keep warm, but despite this, the cold still sunk into her bones. Try as she might, she couldn't stop shivering. Melody was an agent employed at Clockwork and Associates, a company which sat at a crossroads of the universe. It was only accessible by warping and occasionally by falling into a black hole. Melanie had been employed at her company for almost 8 years and quite liked the work she was doing. While the coal had always been consistent, the recent changes in management had agitated those in the workplace and made her nervous. Melody, I have a job for you. Melody raised her head and smiled at her supervisor, James. His scruffy brown beard slightly obscured his smile, but his blue eyes were full of warmth. He was about 10 years older than she was, which only placed him in his mid-30s. Despite his youth, she and her coworkers frequently called him Work Dad. He held a clipboard in one hand, tapping against the side of his leg rhythmically. He had been a drummer all his life, and subconsciously was seeking ways to continue his music making. You've wanted to get out and do some sort of field work as of late, right? I have a job for you. Think you're going to like this one. He sat on the edge of her desk and passed the clipboard to her. This is Catherine Cat Wallace. She's 24 years old. Same age as me. Yeah, interesting, right? This is the first client we've had who was in a 50 to 60-year-old man in a while. Melanie examined the photograph of the woman attached to the clipboard. It was somewhat blurry thanks to the snow, but she could see her long brown hair and green winter coat. She flipped to another picture, this time a close-up shot taken from a window. Kat smiled, her eyes cast downwards. She had one hand pressed up to the headset she was wearing. She's so pretty, Melody said, running a hand through her hair. So what's up with her? Bad boyfriend, bad friends, and a bad job, which she just quit as of 10:15 this morning. James checked his watch, and for the past 2 hours, she's been holed up in a coffee shop desperately applying to jobs on her phone. Poor kid. Really quick, sorry to break break character here for a moment. I remember that we're supposed to warn people about strong language and things like that. There is like some strong language, some swear words here and there. Just a heads up. So what? We're trying to get her to appreciate her life more? She returned the clipboard to him. James nodded. Well, I mean, I guess I'm not sure why, Melody said. I don't understand why she's a candidate for reprogramming, right? She's the last person I would pick for this. But the higher ups have been changing their standards for who gets swapped. Apparently, even people with shitty lives need to learn to appreciate the fact that they're, well, alive, I guess. I don't quite understand, but then again, it's not my job to understand it, just assign the cases. Well, the only reason I bring it up is because she seems like she'd be a difficult case. Are you sure you want to give her to me? James nodded, and then his expression softened. Suddenly, he looked almost too ashamed to look at her. Melody tilted her head to the side, curious. What's wrong? Well, they're also making budget cuts, James said slowly. He tapped the clipboard against his leg a little more urgently. We're no longer going to have administrative roles. Field agents are going to be expected to take on those tasks. Wait a minute. On top of missions, we're going to need to do all that paperwork ourselves? Geez. Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case. So what you're saying is I need to be a full-time field agent again, Melody said flatly. Otherwise, they'll make you fire me. James gave her the saddest puppy dog eyes she had ever seen. I don't want to, Melody. It's just if I don't enforce the rules, you know what happens. Yes, James, I understand. There isn't much else I can do except prove myself, she sighed. It's been a few months since I did some field work. It wasn't that Melody didn't enjoy field work. For nearly 6 years, she had done it daily, and I found the work entertaining, but it was high stress, and even though filing paperwork was mundane, it was a relaxing way to spend her day. She enjoyed those menial tasks, where she could just sit and focus on one thing for hours at a time. There was something satisfying about being able to zone out like that. All right, well, let me get you a digital version of these docs and you can go and grab your equipment. Melanie swiped a finger across the monitor of Intel file system to turn it off. She brushed past the desks of her coworkers back towards the room with the black glass walls. She stepped inside and blinked against the harsh violet UV lights. Glowing green footsteps appeared, directing her to her locker. On the glass walls, green text appeared. Welcome, Melody Adebayo. Melody opened her locker and retrieved her kit, which consisted of a backpack and a small, heavy black box called the Life Modulator. She opened it up by tapping a series of buttons on the surface and unfolded like a map and suspended itself in midair, projecting a purple light. James had already sent her a digital form of the files. She pressed on the file folder, opening it to review the information once more. She couldn't help but linger on the pictures of her patient for a little longer than she normally would. Melody, I'm here to provide assistance in your preparation for mission 83601B, a robotic feminine voice echoed out over the intercom. Please enter a command prompt to initiate system action. Millicent, status on the equipment, VIN number 4892, operating at 100% capacity, last checked during Zulex 01/01/2210. That's been a while. Any reason as to why it hasn't been checked within the past 6 months? Certainly. Electromagnetic pulses administered via the device's charging docks examines the operational status, eliminates need for human involvement, and improves efficiency and output by 50%. That may be so, Melody said, but I still prefer a human touch when it comes to these things. I will put in a request for the equipment to be reevaluated upon your return. Not necessary right now, but thanks, Millicent. If I change my mind when I get back, I'll let you know. Melody folded the Life Modulator again and grabbed her last piece of equipment, a black wand. It was a useful tool, serving as a compatible stylus for the modulator, and also when she pressed a button, it expanded into a hefty baton. This was particularly useful in situations where she ended up in more hostile timelines. The device had countless other uses, but those were its primary functions, and the ones that Melody could remember. James ducked his head inside the locker room. Portal's all booted up for you. Awesome. She followed him out the door and into the elongated hallway where the portal was generated. Pristine white subway tiles covered every surface. Ahead, the purplish gray vortex loomed. To any other person, it would be intimidating, but to a seasoned agent like Melody, it was a welcome sight. She adjusted her backpack straps and gave a thumbs up to the workers on the bridge. They waved it back at her and returned the signal. She smiled and, after taking a deep breath, plunged into the portal. Chapter 2. Carl sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. His controller laid at his feet, and the TV scrolled through the stats of his latest round of PUBG. Kat sat next to him, sniffling, her face blotchy and red. In her hands, she held a series of crumpled tissues stained black from her mascara. She had spent the afternoon applying to jobs, calling various sketchy recruiters, and scrolling through entries on LinkedIn and Indeed. By mid-afternoon, she was drowning in a pool of her regret. After experiencing a brief panic attack, she trudged her way home through the snow. Sobbing, she delivered the bad news to her boyfriend, who was now in a state of shock. Unsurprisingly, he didn't comfort her. Kat, why in the hell would you do that? Carl was exasperated, tossing his hair over and over again. You couldn't wait until you got something else lined up? It's fine. I have some savings piled up. I could get another job. You could, but will you? She narrowed her eyes. I don't know. Will you? Don't put this on me. You've been unemployed longer than I have, Carl, and at least I spent the day applying to new jobs. Why do you expect me to support the two of us? Because you're the one who was gainfully employed. Not only that, but you made good money. This job wasn't meant to be permanent. Sooner or later, they would have fired me. And you couldn't wait for them to fire you? They would have at least given you a severance package. He shook his head. I wish you would talk to me before you did this. Fuck you, Carl. You know I hated that job. You know I couldn't stand the bullshit. But we all have to put up with bullshit in our lives, Kat. It's part of being an adult. Kat blinked. He stared back blankly, unable to comprehend the irony of his words. In that moment, she was so overcome with rage that she was frozen in place. Her hands trembled, and she resisted the urge to clench her fists. She shredded the used tissues into confetti, allowing the pieces to flutter to the ground. You know what's also part of being an adult? Not sitting around on your ass all day playing video games, Kat seethed, her eyes wide with anger. Pack your shit and get out. Are you serious? Are you serious? She jumped to her feet and started unplugging the Xbox. He shouted at her to stop, but she didn't listen. All the months I've spent supporting your ass, while you do nothing all day long. And when I expect you to give a little fucking compassion, you tear into me? She threw the cables at his feet. Get out. You can't kick me out of here, Kat. I have nowhere else to go. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket, holding it up. I will call the police. You have 15 minutes to get your shit and get out of my apartment. You've got to be kidding me. You need to calm down. Uh-huh. She searched for the non-emergency number on the Minneapolis police website. He reached for her phone and tried to grab it from her, but she leaped out of his grasp. She hurtled down the hallway and locked herself in the bathroom. Static crackled over the phone, and Kat paced about the small space, trying to find a more secure connection. She heard an odd, long beeping tone, and then a dispatcher by the name of Wendy introduced herself. Yes, hello? My name is Kat Wallace. My ex refuses to vacate my apartment. She jumped, startled when Carl began aggressively jiggling the door handle. He's starting to escalate and I could use some assistance. Stop calling the cops, Carl shouted through the door, banging on it a few times. I will leave. Just hand me my toothbrush. Kat rolled her eyes. Yes, thank you, Wendy. Yeah, as soon as possible. No, he shouldn't be any threat. He's just an idiot. Yep. She sat on the toilet, scrolling through her Facebook newsfeed. She listened to Carl rummage through cabinets and dresser drawers, muttering curse words underneath his breath. When she grew bored with Facebook, she examined the grout of the tile, lined with mildew and aged soap scum. She could only imagine the state of the toilet. Now that she was jobless, maybe she would deep clean this nasty place. She smirked at the thought. Clean up her messy apartment, clean up her messy life, killing two birds with one stone. A knock at the door and a Jesus H. Christ from Carl signaled the police were here. Kat opened the bathroom door and handed Carl his toothbrush. She greeted the officer at the front door, a young black woman whose uniform looked oddly too big for her. Her long braided hair framed her face, hanging almost low enough to touch her shoulders. She smiled, revealing perfect white teeth that almost blinded her. Hello, officer. Kat was confused. She didn't understand why they wouldn't have sent over a more intimidating individual. This woman was more beauty queen than she was a cop. Officer Adebayo, the woman responded, pulling up her pants by her leather belt. You call this about a disturbance? Yeah, my ex was refusing to vacate the premises. She pointed over her shoulder at a seething Carl, who was struggling to lift a mountain of stuff. Can you escort him to the curb, please? Certainly. Officer Adebayo cleared her throat and motioned for Carl to follow her out the door. Carl elbowed Kat as she passed by her. She rolled her eyes and shut the door. She turned to the pile of dishes he had accumulated in the sink and with a heavy sigh rolled up her sleeves. She started washing them. Not 15 minutes later, and she heard another knock on her door. Are you serious, Carl? You literally waited until the cop left to come back? Kat jerked open the door with a huff and was surprised to see the officer standing there. She smiled politely. I wanted to stop back and check in on you. In these kinds of situations, I am required to do a wellness check, she said as she removed a legal pad from her pocket. Can you tell me, did your ex-boyfriend get physical with you at all? No. I mean, he elbowed me on his way out the door, but that's just because he's a douchebag. I'm okay. Thank you, officer. Adebayo smiled. My pleasure. I've been through my fair share of bad breakups. Ever been with a freeloader? Kat smirked. Fortunately, no. The officer chuckled. I'm glad you're okay, ma'am. Thanks, Kat said quietly. Suddenly, she felt tired and painfully sad. She hiccuped and tried to hold back her tears. Adebayo reached out and touched her shoulder. Ma'am, you're sure he didn't hit you, right? You're not injured? Kat shook her head. No, I'm so sorry. I'm just tired. I quit my job and I dumped my boyfriend today. Everything's a mess right now and I just wanted to get better. Of course, the officer nodded. I'm sure things will get better. I sure hope so, Kat laughed. At this point, I'm counting on a miracle. Miracles happen every day. She removed her baton, grimacing. Kat eyed her warily, wiping her eyes. What are you doing? The officer pressed a button on the baton and it instantaneously shrunk into a small little wand. Before Kat could speak or step away, the tip was pressed against her forehead. Sleep, Melody ordered. Kat's eyelids fluttered and she collapsed, falling forward on Melody's shoulder. Crouching low, Melody swiped an arm underneath Kat so that she could scoop her up. This was not a simple task as Kat was about 4 inches taller than she was. The added weight put an enormous amount of pressure on her shoulders. Note to self, start weightlifting again, Melody thought. Gritting her teeth, Melody cradled Kat in her arms and shuffled over to the couch. She laid her down as gently as she could. She shut the front door and locked it, turned off the lights, and drifted back to where her patient slept. She pressed a button on her life modulator wand, and in a flurry of holographic flakes, her police uniform disappeared, revealing her true outfit underneath. You're going to be a tough case, Melody murmured, pushing back strands of Kat's hair out of her face. After all, I don't see what you have to be grateful for. A roof over your head, I suppose. For the most part, Melody's clients were older, wealthy individuals that lamented the limitations of their grandiose fortunes. They'd rant and rave about why they couldn't have a larger house, a better car, a nicer yacht. Kat was different. All she wanted was a job that she could stand and decent people in her life. Those were the basics of human happiness, and they weren't too much to ask for. Melody turned on the life modulator and unfolded it. She then adjusted it to form a cone around Kat's head. Load the simulation, she told the machine, tapping it briefly with her wand, as per protocol. She unraveled a series of cords and wires from a compact container inside the life modulator. She counted down from 30, and in that moment the device flashed, illuminating the room in its purple light. The simulation had begun. And that's all I got.
So this is from Cadence and the Pearl. It was the novel that came out from JMS Books earlier this year in ebook. It'll be out in paperback later this year, towards the end of the year. So we'll get a fun paperback version. Also has a really pretty cover. I like it. I'd show you, except I'm holding my iPad. And it's the book that I describe to people as partly about mermaids and merpeople, and partly about coming home again after having grown up and gone away and built your own life, and partly about ocean magic, and partly about a kind of alternate history, 17th century setting in kind of the British Isles, the Northern Isles, where magic might or might not be real. And there's always been stories about maybe mermaids or a strange place under the ocean, but nobody really takes it seriously. Right? And it's also partially about coming home and falling in love with the quiet local school teacher who might have a secret. And this particular section is from chapter 2, and Cadence, who's our title character, who's gone off and become successful down in the capital cities. He's a successful playwright. He's Kit Marlowe, more or less. He's come back because his parents have left him the family inn. And that morning, when they'd gone for a walk, he found a pearl on the beach. And it wasn't just an ordinary pearl. It seemed to have something seductive or tantalizing. When he picked it up, it made a noise. It sang to him. And there's something both really intriguing and slightly ominous about that. He had left his pearl in his pocket getting dressed. It brushed against his leg, a reminder. It tempted him. Jeremiah would leave for the morning off to that schoolhouse. Cade could explore the secrets, could hear it sing again, perhaps, could see what it wanted to show him. He was aware that he should perhaps share this secret. Jeremiah would be interested, both professionally and personally, as a teacher, as a lover of stray bits of knowledge. Gwen and Reese, minding the inn downstairs, might know local stories about random pearls washing ashore, stray bits of magic, or just treasures from a shipwreck. Hiding the pearl, concealing it, even lying when asked what he'd been picking up that morning, was probably a sign of some sort of danger, whether sorceress or just his own overwhelmed head. He knew all that, but for right now, the pearl was his. It had nothing to do with his parents, or his grief, or their inn, or all the responsibility unexpectedly dumped on his head. It had nothing to do with the life he thought he'd left behind, the dull stones and bird cries and fishermen's calls of Gulscary, of the island he'd run away from. For now, his pearl was his, so he said nothing, and he held Jeremiah's hand and smiled as they went downstairs. The inn's common room was full of fishermen and women, forming knots and eddies of camaraderie, strong tea, salted fish, and bacon used for emphasis when gesturing. Gwen, probably in defiance of yesterday's comments about her cooking, had made porridge. A giant tub of it sat proudly on the main table. A few people looked up and waved and called out to them. Jeremiah waved back, dropped Cade's hand, ran for bacon. Cade nodded that way, wondered whether he ought to wave too, and wondered what they thought. His hair was loose, falling over his shoulders, a contrast to hard-working practical ties and braids. His wardrobe of city satin and velvet, stylishly slashed sleeves and be-ribboned dressing gowns, clashed with rough homespun and sea salt, no matter how desperately he hunted down old trousers and loose shirts. He knew most of the morning crowd had known his parents. He knew they knew him as the boy who'd gone away, down south, who'd found fame with pen and ink and poetry. From occasional overheard remarks in the last month, he guessed the residents of the island regarded him with both pride and suspicion. Jeremiah was waving at him from a bench. Cade collected honey and cream and Gwen's porridge, rather bemusedly, and went. Sometimes, Jeremiah said, waving bacon and fingertips as Cade sat down with him, I still can't quite believe it. You, Cadence Bell, and me, a school teacher, from the islands. Yes, Cade said. I don't mean I expect anything. Jeremiah regarded his bacon with some astonishment, as if he'd forgotten it, and then ate it. Around the bite, he explained, I know you're not staying here. I know you wouldn't. I know you have a life down south. I just was thinking, I'm surprised by it sometimes. By us. I've heard that one. Cade poured cream into porridge, a slow curl of sensuous white. It pooled into the hollow he'd made for it, lapping at sides. My life, surprising, shocking, scandalous, infamous, famous. Jeremiah's foot nudged his under the table. Growing up, I thought you didn't even know my name. Not that you had to, not that you needed to. Cadence, who in fact would have thought the same at the time, in the present found himself unusually uncomfortable about the ready acceptance of this fact on that side. He ate some porridge, so he didn't have to answer. His pearl weighed down his pocket, mysteriously heavy for its size. Stories, he thought. Water nymphs and fairy legends. Maybe a musical interlude or a lyric poem. Secrets on a rock at the edge of the world. And a tripping light melody like the transparent fluttering edges of wings and foamy waves. Do you think, he said into the pause, that magic might be real? I mean, not real, not really. In stories, Ray said, coming and going from the kitchen with the teapot, or in the ways the fishing crews talk. Miracles, rescues, voices on the wind, maybe, sure. Tall tales, Kid said into his tea. Of course. Yes, Jeremiah said unexpectedly. I don't mean like legendary sorcerers or wicked witches or anything like the ghosts you wrote in the tragedy of King Beryl. I did see it. But other lands, under the sea or in the air, other people who can see the world in ways we can't. Not quite human, maybe. Kate contemplated this fanciful assertion with some amazement. Aren't you a school teacher? Jeremiah's ears went pink, confronted with this suggestion of impractical thinking. You asked, and I thought maybe, out of everyone, maybe you would have also seen. Never mind. It's for the opera, right? You're wondering about sirens and plots. Have you given up on the milkmaid and the prince in disguise? Jer, Reese said, reappearing, you'll be late. Jeremiah glared at the clock, did not swear at it, even though many people would have, grabbed his school bag, blew a kiss at Kate on the way out, airy, hurried, affectionate, and pleased. Let me know if that helps with the plot, and I'll be back after classes end. Kate watched him go, a tall, gentle island of a man in a sea of weathered fisher folk, big shoulders apologetically fitting between bodies. Jeremiah stopped to say hello to a few of them, accepted an apple, a handshake, words from a parent or two. He finally ducked out the door, which opened to stream early morning sunbeams around him. Kate did not lift fingers to touch his own lips, though he had the impulse to. The kiss lingered, unexpectedly brushing something deeper than skin, leaving notes of sweet tea and crumbled bacon and warmth. I would have seen what, he thought suddenly. What did you want me to have seen? To have also seen, as if you have. That sounded like a secret, and that made no sense. Jeremiah had no secrets as far as he knew. An open book standing in a classroom, sharing knowledge with fishermen's children. They paused for a sip of tea, left hands cradling the heat, let the mystery tug at daydream strings for a moment. Jeremiah the clandestine merman, sprouting tail and fins in a bathing tub. Jeremiah the narwhal shapeshifter, pouring pirouetting from his forehead mid-change. Jeremiah the water magician, who could talk to mackerel. Improbable, he concluded. Unlikely. Pure fancy. But the question lingered, and Kate found that he wanted to know the answer. He wanted to know, with an intensity that he had not anticipated, and it astounded him, rich and tempting as the next sip of tea. After breakfast, he took the tea back up to his room and settled into the low-cushioned window seat, tugging a blanket over his toes. He had letters to answer, lyrics to try to write, an opera he should be composing. He stared blankly at the sea and the sky through glass. Grayness crashed and coiled and swung overhead. Clouds and rolling oceans squared off across rough stone. Out on the water, the fishing boats were hard at work. He couldn't see any detail, but could imagine. A few seabirds swooped above, black specks crossing his vision. Rocks at the end of the world, fishnets and salt in his hair, gull song and wet boats by the fire. His parents had loved the island. It had been a home for them, a cozy mug of tea, the lamplight spilling from the windows of the bell. The inn itself gathered up the island's social life and wove it together, rustic and messy and casual as hand-whittled wooden decorations. His parents had been kind and generous and uncomplicated, trying their best for a son who daydreamed about pirates and princesses and brightly hued costumes. At 17, when he'd left home, he'd been sure he'd known what he wanted. He'd known he did not want his parents' life. Like most 17-year-old children, he thought. He had meant to come home. Later, another year, after another successful theatrical season, when Queen Lissa did not require his presence as the artistic advisor, redecorating her new palace, or helping write royal addresses, or choosing themes and decorations for the midwinter masque. When the storms relented, when travel north got easier, the year after, someday. He pulled both legs up and wrapped his arms around them. His hair fell into one eye, and he brushed it away again. Jeremiah would be busy in the small weathered schoolhouse with the new blue door, teaching mathematics and reading and history to the children of fishermen and bakers and sailmakers, probably gently explaining historical cause and effect or the difference between verb tenses he had decided. Patiently posed at a chalkboard or bending down at a desk, big shoulders careful not to intimidate. He'd watched Jeremiah marking essay compositions the week before, intent and scholarly. He'd ended up reaching over, running fingers along Jer's arm, up to a rolled up shirt sleeve, and Jeremiah, looking up, had smiled. The essays had ended up on the floor. In the present, he touched fingers to the cool glass of the window. He thought again about Jeremiah, about school teachers, and secrets, and the question nagged at him again. What did you want me to have seen? You said, as if I'd also seen something. What was it? And the pearl in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, seemed to sing again, a hum of melody that he thought he recognized. He wanted to hear it more. And it's 4:27, so I think we'll stop right there. We've got about 3 minutes. And if you have questions, ask us things.
Yes. Oh, we got something in the Q&A. Duality, yes. Duality, so it was chosen because essentially there's two worlds that they primarily are traveling between. So it's about parallel universes, but it's also kind of secretly sort of hinting at the fact that there are two sides to people, or that some people can be a little bit two-faced. So the protagonist herself, Kat, is a little bit two-faced in that she kind of presents herself as this person that has, oh, woe is me, like I've struggled so much, my life never works out for myself. But as it turns out, and as you find out when reading the book, she's done some things to other people that have made her, that have hurt them and made their lives worse. So it's kind of examining sort of the multiple aspects that a person can have to their personality, as well as there's just two universes that they're traveling between.
We've got one in the chat, it looks like. What are we both working on now? Do you want to go ahead, or do you want me to?
You can
go ahead and jump in.
You can go ahead.
Okay. The two things that I'm working on right now are, well, the thing that will be out next month, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is the super short flash fiction lesbian fantasy erotica with the Earth Witch and her princess. It'll be out with JMS Books July 22nd, which is very fun, and it's got, you know, a princess in need of advice and a witch who works divination spells with honey, and you can think of some other interesting uses for honey. I am also finishing up doing edits for the last story in the Demon for Midwinter universe. There will be one more, which will also be out probably in July, and then we'll do a box set of everything, the novel and the 4, I think we're up to 5 now, short stories that come with it. And that will be really fun. And that's also exciting because this was my first published novel, so it was neat to come back to it. And then, what else am I working on? The enormous trilogy that will start getting published by JMS in, I think, September, which will be the trilogy that's sort of historical contemporary. The main characters are actors, but they're filming a gay Regency romance that I keep describing as it's Master and Commander, but more gay, if that's possible. So that will be starting to come out also later this year.
Cool. I'm just pretty much working on outlining the sequel to Duality, getting kind of the structure for that set up. I'm also a filmmaker, so and like a self-taught animator, so I'm actually working on a small, it's not a sci-fi film, but it's just a small 10-minute animated film about two girls in the 1990s who are split up from each other for an entire summer, and it's about how they spend time on the phone. It's just trying to keep in touch with each other and trying to relate to one another, even though they're like hundreds of miles apart. So that's pretty much what I'm doing right now creatively. I think things are winding down for me, which I actually kind of need to do, like kind of relax a little bit. Okay. And then when did you start writing queer fic, or was your work always queer? Oh gosh.
Inherently, it probably always is to some extent.
Yeah.
realized back in high school I was probably bisexual or something along those lines. Although I didn't quite have the terminology sorted out. So in that sense, quite a lot of it always is. But as far as publishing specifically things that were, gay or lesbian or bisexual, probably within the last 5 years or so. Actually, that's not true. One of my short stories with Allura's Cave, wow, I'm old, ages ago, was an short, but primarily, and I've been writing fanfic for ages, so there's lots of things in there that we could talk about. So I guess the short answer to that is always to some extent, although I did also write some het and things as well along the way.
Yeah, I think I wrote more heterosexual romances. I've been writing pretty much ever since I was like old enough to be able to type on the computer. That I had a ridiculously like fast typing speed for a lot of kids in school. It freaked them out. Made me subject to many bad conversations. But a lot of my when I was very young, a lot of my stories were revolved around heterosexual relationships. But as I grew older and kind of came in touch more with my sexuality, but also in the understanding of like the kind of stories that I wanted to tell, then it became like more queer. And now it's just like very much just very queer, and more so focused on women than it was before. I used to, like as a teenager, very specifically kind of wrote a lot about queer men and like bisexual men, just because I think that like I was trying to kind of distance myself from the fact that I was becoming queer myself, or realizing that I was queer myself. But yeah, nowadays I pretty much write about queer women predominantly.
So we've got a few more in the Q&A, a couple of which are pretty similar about outlining and process and being a plotter or pantser or linear and non-linear. I guess I'll start with that one. And the first part that was, this is from J. Scott Coatsworth, who we all probably know by now. Hi. So how do I decide what to write? The short answer is characters tend to turn up and have something to say. I write very non-linearly, which is a very weird thing if I try to co-author with anyone, which I sometimes do. If Kelly is around, K.S. Murphy, we're working on a secret project together, which I'm sure I'm super annoying about because I don't write linearly. I usually start with an important conversation or a scene or a moment that somehow encapsulates what one of the characters wants or desires or something along those lines, and kind of build outward from there. How did they get there? And then what happens as a result of that and what changes. But then I'm also a very weird person who, unless it's a super short thing, doesn't ever write the opening first because I have a hard time with that. I also do like, because I'm in the other life a medievalist and folklorist, so there's a lot of things that come out of that. If I've been reading, Marie de France's 12th century queer werewolf story, for instance, I might end up wanting to rewrite it as a proper outright romance, which I have done, in fact. Chloe, you want to talk about your process?
Yeah, my process, I usually just kind of come up with that. Honestly, like I think prior to the past couple of years, I didn't really do like a whole lot of outlining. I pretty much kind of visualized everything in my head, if that makes sense, and I kind of identified what sort of beats I wanted to work on and how I wanted to move the story forward. I think that now I'm using more structure, and I actually like using more structure because then it kind of keeps me on track in terms of what I wanted to write. But kind of in my mind, I used to think about like scenes that I would want to write for that book, and then I would think about those scenes and where I would want to put them into the story, which wasn't not always like the best thing. Now that I'm getting more into screenwriting, because of my work as a graduate student in film and television, I'm starting to learn more about like story beats and story arcs and how to specifically construct something in a very concise way instead of like throwing everything out there all at once. Which I think I've really particularly enjoyed.
And as far as, we have one more that kind of has to do with process. Do we tend to outline or just write, or how much structure do we do?
Yeah.
Structuring?
Yeah, nowadays I think I'm doing a little bit more outlining. Definitely a little bit more outlining, working with a little bit. I try to use like some worksheets when it comes to outlining things, and other days if I have an idea for something but I don't know if I really want to flesh it out into a full book or a full story, I'll just sit down and I'll write. It really kind of, I guess, depends on the situation, depends on my mood and how I'm feeling.
Yeah, and for me, if it's something very short, if it's going to be a short story or something, I won't necessarily outline. I might make a few notes. Also, if it's based on a story that I know, again, like some of the medieval things, like my Biscovere retelling, I know that well enough that I can sit down and write. I've started outlining more and more. The very large trilogy that's happening later this year, I did the most complicated outline for that I ever have. I had to make 3 different outlines because I had to do the outline of the actual trilogy plot, the outline of the film that they were filming, and then the outline of filming order because they were filming scenes out of order. And it was terrible and horrible. And I have like 3 different Word documents with things moved around, but it was also really fun. Um, so I've started doing more and more outlining. And the other thing that I usually do is write with music or playlists. I tend to have character playlists a lot. Um, so that helps too. I have things that work with a certain mood or scenes that I'm working on. So I do also usually write with music.
Music is a really good tool. Yeah, especially if you're trying to write like an emotional scene. I've had moments where I've been like this one specific song, like this is the thing that I want to kind of like this is the if this scene was a movie, like this is the song that I would want to play during the movie. Yeah.
Oh yes, that would be like the fantasy version if we had all the money and all the rights to all the music. Like
Right.
that's
Oh
what we
my gosh.
have in the background.
Music rights not fun. Uh
I
yeah.
mean, mine would be so heavily skewed towards like 70s, 80s, 90s punk rock music.
Oh,
But
that's specific. Yeah, I tend to gravitate more towards definitely like 80s rock music. And I've got like I was jamming really like to the Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers greatest hit CD that came out like in Target a little bit back, and so I've been listening to that. But I also really used to listen to like Maroon 5 songs about Jane like over and over again to an embarrassing extent. Oh, looks like we have another question here.
I do.
How did you get started writing, and do you, like me, ever feel imposter syndrome? Um, yeah, so how I got started writing, like when I was a kid, it was just because I was bored and I didn't want to go outside and I didn't do anything. And I think that I used to kind of start writing about stories about animals or kind of rip-offs, quite frankly, of like animated films that I had seen that maybe didn't go in like a plot direction that I wanted them to go in. And then when I got older, I did dabble in some fan fiction, which I think is a little bit, it's pretty bad. Like it's a little cringy. I know there's good fan fiction, and then there's like my fan fiction, which is like no, put it at the bottom of the barrel. But yeah, so that's and then later I got into writing more so comics because I wanted to kind of explore drawing. So I for a long time I wasn't really writing any books or really anything beyond like a short story. I was more so like drawing comics. Um, when it comes to the imposter syndrome, yeah, I definitely feel that a lot, just because I'm still pretty young, so being at I'm only 23, so being at an event like this is actually my first time speaking on a panel. I'm just kind of a little bit starry-eyed and a little bit kind of in awe that I'm welcomed here to be alongside so many talented writers and authors. When it comes to like fighting back against imposter syndrome, though, I think it's just kind of keeping in mind like that your work has value and that there's a reason why you're here. And you know, you're not here to necessarily be competing with other people. That's not what this is about. It's about like forming connections with other people and networking and learning more so about the craft and connecting with each other on things that you love, which is writing and sci-fi. Yeah, but KL?
Yeah, how did I get started? I've been writing since I was really young, as my parents will tell you if you ever meet them. They'll tell you the story about 5-year-old me writing a story about the tooth fairy bringing a little girl a unicorn instead of money for her lost tooth. And they probably still have that story somewhere. And there's no plot at all other than, yay, I've got a unicorn. But it was 5 pages of a story. And it kind of never stopped. It changed with the things I was reading at the time, sometimes more fantasy, sometimes things that are very Mercedes Lackey inspired, for instance, sometimes things I was reading in grad school, sometimes a lot of fanfic. Sometimes it was the ill-advised Star Wars fanfic that I wrote just for myself in the notebook with the kitty on it that no one's ever seen. But later it turned into things like, Marvel and Supernatural, although not so much anymore, but that was kind of the first fandom I was in back around season 4. And one of the things that did, as I was getting better as a writer too, but there was this real sense of community and this sense of fun to it. Like, we're doing this because we love this thing. We're doing this because we're excited about this thing, and we're going to make more of it. And that also extended into outside of fandom, but professional kind of science fiction fantasy writers too. There is that sense of shared joy in what we do, in creating things and new worlds and new fantasies, and that desire to read something that someone else has written and just be amazed by it. Like, oh, this is neat. And there's mutual support there, which has been a really nice thing to have. So that's sort of the writing story. And then because I had friends and people who were reading my stuff and liking it, how do I deal with imposter syndrome? There's a lot of reminding yourself that, like you said, it's not a competition. There will be other people who write the right thing at the right time or don't. So much of it is luck. So much of it is also supporting each other, getting involved and doing things. And sometimes going back and rereading nice things that people have said, nice comments or reviews, thinking, maybe I do like this, or even rereading your own work, because as much as we all sometimes read our own work and cringe and get, despairing and throw it across the room, we also sometimes read our work and we really like it, right? You know that feeling when you go back and read something that you've written and you're like, that was really good, I wrote that. And that's cool. And that's a nice feeling, and it's a good feeling to have to sort of fight back against the imposter syndrome. We've got a question that says, were you ever part of a writing group when you were younger, and are you part of one now? Have you been?
I used to collaborate when I was way younger. I used to collaborate with some of my classmates in like writing and drawing comics, and I was the artist. But it wasn't necessarily like a writing group, and it didn't usually like last too long. Right now, like I do, because screenwriting and writing for like film and television can be like a very collaborative process. I mean, you do have like a writer's room for those kinds of things. I am learning to collaborate with other people more in kind of like a writer's room sort of environment. And that has definitely been very different, like a very different experience, and certainly a challenging one, because I'm so used to just staying in my own head and just putting things on a page and then like sending it off to an editor and having them look at it and tell me if it makes sense or not. So this has definitely been, it's definitely been different, but I think it's also challenged me to kind of think about how I work on characterization and how I think about plot details. But it has also reminded me about things where it's best not to hyper focus or like hyper fixate on. I'm working with people right now that sometimes they'll bring up like plot points that I don't think are pretty relevant, or like details that I think they're very small and insignificant into the larger work of the story. So that's kind of my experience. But what about you, KL?
Yeah, I've never really done the formal writing group thing either. I did one creative writing class once, I think in college, and it was okay. It wasn't a terrible experience, but I also didn't feel like it was terribly helpful. I felt like I was the one writing the weirdest things, fantasy, sci-fi, romance things, and there were a lot of people doing things like, I'm working on this memoir, or the great American novel, or things that didn't seem to intersect with what I was doing. And it seemed to be, it was fine, but it wasn't as helpful. There were critiques about moving plot faster for some things, which was helpful. But mostly I found that the most helpful comments I get come from the friends that I invite to read things, the author friends who read things over, the early drafts of things, and then they can point at specific parts and say, oh, I love that, or oh, I have a question about this. It's sort of an informal, like, these are my friends, let's share. But no, I've never actually been part of a writing group, unless you count grad school and seminar paper writing groups, which is a whole different thing where we cry a lot about our research.
Yeah. Happy hour. Are we drinking anything? I'm just drinking. I was drinking water. My water is now gone.
I know I had water also, but I am going to go open a good craft beer after this, probably something that's barrel aged and has interesting vanilla notes or something. Got one more quick question from Kelly. I feel like this is very pointed because we're collaborating.
Oh,
Are
yes.
you ever called away from a current project because a new idea is talking loudly in your head? Yes, and you know that.
Yeah.
All the time. It happens all the time. You're working on something and another idea or plot bunny or thing pops up and demands attention. Usually I'm pretty good about it if I write down the specific scene or moment or thing that's in my head and then make some notes for later and I'll come back to it. But it does happen and it is both annoying but also exciting because it's nice to know that I'm still having ideas.
Right.
Does that happen?
Right. It kind of feels like you'd rather have too many ideas than have none, because those time periods where you just go through like that drought of ideas. It can be a little bit disappointing, a little bit sad. But yeah, I've definitely been one person that has juggled like way too many projects at once. I probably always will be that kind of person. But how I kind of keep track is I pretty much just like make lists. Sometimes I'll set deadlines for myself. I've got, for example, this short film that I'm working on right now. Like I know I have to finish it before the end of the month. So I've got like 9 minutes left up to animate. So that's a lot to finish in less than 10 days. So that's great.
On the academic side, I should be working on page proofs for the Terry Pratchett and ethics book that's due at the end of the month that I'm not currently working on.
Yeah.
I've got a couple weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be fine. Yeah. No worries. Well, cool.
It is 4:49, so I guess thanks to everyone for being here and hanging out with us. And our next panel will start at 5, which is, let me find that one. Oh, it's the people of color in speculative fiction.
I'm very excited for that one.
Yeah, this is such a good discussion. And we will see you guys then.